Now, the first three that I mentioned, defense, economics, and constitutional, have essentially failed over the last century to become the dominant aspect of Commonwealth identity. Though they are still active, that they are still involved in the Commonwealth life, those three have generally been found not to be the basis for unity, and therefore are no longer the ones we look to, and I'll explain why. And we are left with the last two, which I call values and sentiment, as the two that are still in play. So looking at the five, let's start with defense. Defense was important, of course, to the unity of the empire and even into the Commonwealth, but it was always qualified. The imperial government in London was concerned with defending the entire empire as the empire grew. The colonies and then dominions, as they grew up and to become dominions, were never interested in imperial defense outside of their own region. Canada was interested in imperial defense in North America, but they were not interested in imperial defense policies in Africa or Asia or even in Europe. Australia and New Zealand were concerned about defense in their region in the Pacific, but not particularly concerned about what was happening in North America. Thus, you had this scenario where, I'll stick with Canada for a second, the Canadian position, and it didn't matter whether it was Sir John A. Macdonald's Conservatives or Sir Wilfrid Laurier's Liberals or Sir Robert Borden's Conservatives or on to Mackenzie King's Liberals into the 20th century, that Canadians were not interested in what could be termed imperial adventures. And Macdonald made this clear that Canadians would not go to take part in the expansion of the empire, as officially individuals might, but no official Canadian contribution in the battles in Egypt or the Sudan and so forth. And he was as strong as that as Laurier was later. And this continued, as I said, right into the 20th century. In 1922, the incident at Shanaq, that was after the war, and the Greeks and Turks were having a go at each other. And there was a British force at Shanaq, which is the coast of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and there was under threat by Turkish troops might come into conflict with the British, and Churchill told the Turks, not to go any further, because if they did, they would face the full wrath of the British Empire. At which point, Mackenzie King made it quite clear that Canada would not get involved in Shanaq, and that if the British got into a fight with Turkey, they would not count on Canadian support. No Canadian troops would go to fight in Shanaq. But that didn't even end there. We can go later. Second World War, we think now, well, everybody was clear that when Britain defended the borders, or guaranteed the borders of Poland, along with France guaranteeing the Polish borders in 1938 after the Sudetenland was taken over, and then all of Czechoslovakia by Nazi Germany, that, well, of course, everyone agreed, we had to stop them in Poland. But when the British government issued the guarantee for Polish borders, Mackenzie King immediately said that Canada was not bound by that, and said that Canadians had absolutely no interest in what the borders of Poland were and would not be defending those borders. Now, a year later, when the war came, Canada did go to war. So that was, I think, there right throughout, and it wasn't just in Canada. Australians felt more or less the same. On the other hand, the Dominions were also equally strong that a threat to the empire itself was a different matter. That's when Britain could count on the Dominions' full support. And in fact, Laurier made the argument that if the imperial government tied up or tried to force Canadians to be involved in adventures in Africa and Asia, it would just create animosity in Canada. It would make Canadians less likely to come to the defense of the empire as a whole if the empire was ever threatened. So Laurier made the argument that by not getting Canada involved in these imperial adventures now, that Canada would be that much more loyal if a real crisis came. And he was proved correct in 1914 when World War I came and Canadians responded magnificently to come to the defense of the empire, because that was not seen as an imperial adventure but as an existential threat to the empire itself. The South African War should be seen in that light. As critics sometimes say, well, English Canadians wanted to get involved in imperial adventures there and French Canadians didn't. I don't think that's the case. I think what we saw in South Africa was not an exception to this view, that Canadians generally were against all imperial adventures but also in agreement on any threat to the empire. What happened in the Boer War was a difference of opinion between, not entirely French and English, but large distinction between French and English. French Canadians saw the South African War as an imperial adventure, which was therefore of no concern to Canada. English Canadians saw it as an existential threat to the integrity of the empire, and therefore fell into the category that Canada had an obligation to defend it. I think if Canadians had in fact seen, English Canadians had seen it as an imperial adventure, English Canadians would have opposed being involved as much as French Canadians. This distinction resulted in development of separate navies. In peacetime, the Royal Canadian Navy, of course, founded in 1910, the name in 1911, but the Naval Service in 1910, and disputes over with the imperial authorities, should Dominion fleets be for coastal defense, should the Admiralty control everything internationally. So it was never a clean-cut decision. There were always these conflicts between what role the imperial government should play, what role the Dominion government should play in governing and defending the empire. The critical moment, I think, for the notion, however, of a strategic defense policy for the empire, because as I mentioned, the Dominions all agreed that an existential threat to the empire as a whole would require everybody to be involved, that was possible. There was a strategic defense of the empire that had to be maintained. That ended, I believe, with the fall of Singapore in early 1914 to the Japanese. With the fall of Singapore, which was the greatest surrender in British arms history, British arms, it was an utter disaster for British prestige, and it had two effects. Not so much in Canada. Canada wasn't as affected by this, but Australia, New Zealand, and the non-self-governing parts of the empire in India, Malaysia, Burma, and Hong Kong, and other parts of Asia were dramatically affected. In the case of Australia and New Zealand, the idea of imperial defense was that all parts would be defended by the empire as a whole. But they felt that the British, the Admiralty, and the Army had concentrated on European defense in the Second World War and had neglected the Pacific and Asia. So that's why Singapore fell, and they could no longer count, even though they were British themselves and proud of their ties, for defense they could no longer count on the United Kingdom, and they turned to the United States. And of course, Japan, having attacked the United States the same day as they attacked the British Empire, the U.S. was in the war. And from 1942 right through to today, Australia has looked primarily to the United States for its strategic defense. They didn't, end the relationship with the UK, but the U.S. became more dominant in Australian thinking, even to the point that if you look at an Australian ship today, it looks like an American ship. They put their numbers at the bow of the ship, and they do them exactly the same as the Americans. All this started from trying to look like the Americans in the Second World War, whereas Canadian ships still look like British ships in terms of how we have where we place the numbers below the bridge rather than at the bow. For the non-self-governing parts of the empire in the East, the fall of Singapore had a somewhat different but equally profound effect. They had not had the ability to govern themselves. They felt, rightly or wrongly, in many cases correctly, that they had been oppressed. They certainly didn't have control of their own destiny. Well, it was one thing to be governed by outsiders or an imperial center if at least the imperial center could defend you. So if you felt you were being discriminated against, or even in the extreme case you were being oppressed, at least if your masters could control. But if your masters now lost to another Asiatic power, in this case to Japan, the British lost face and all of a sudden the Asian countries in the empire thought, why are we under this authority if they can't even defend the empire? And that fueled dramatically the drive for independence in India and other parts of Asia. Now, of course, the war continued and nothing was done until after the war, but the result was the idea of putting back the British Empire as it was pre-World War II was never a reality after the war. And although we're talking 1948, 49 for India and into the 50s and 60s, when the process continued right into the 1970s, I think you can look to the fall of Singapore in 1942 as the beginning of that process. So since World War II, therefore, there has been no pretense even of a strategic defense of the empire, or now Commonwealth. Countries in the Commonwealth work together. Canada and UK are allies in NATO. UK still maintains alliances with Australia and New Zealand. Canada works with Australia and New Zealand on a very friendly basis. Canada has close strategic ties with the West Indies. We just signed a defense agreement with Jamaica last year. We're very much involved, the Royal Canadian Navy, in defending the West Indies against drug cartels. Canadian ships are down there regularly. So I'm not suggesting that countries in the Commonwealth don't care about each other. We fought together in Korea in the Commonwealth Division. But there is no longer a sense of a strategic defense of the Commonwealth. Canada's arrangement with Jamaica has to do with the interests of Jamaica and Canada and the West Indies. It's not about, that's of no interest to the African part of the Commonwealth. So we're sort of back to where we always had our regional interests, which were there in the 19th century, but there's no longer the strategic Commonwealth umbrella over that as well. So defense as a basis for Commonwealth unity or association going forward, I just don't see as likely. Now, having said that, there are people still pushing for it. This was an article in British naval journal called Warships and International Fleet Review, and one of the writers in 2010 wrote an article, "Is it time for a Commonwealth Navy?" Well, nothing has happened in the last 3 years, so I suspect that's the answer. But so some people are still suggesting that, but I don't really see that as likely. If we move to economics, it's a very similar situation to defense. Economics was, of course, a part of the empire, but close and common economic policy was never essential. As I mentioned, the United Kingdom always, from the 19th century, the mid-19th century, pursued free trade. On the other hand, the colonies and then dominions often preferred tariffs. Sir John A. Macdonald's national policy was to build up Canadian agriculture and in particular manufacturing through a tariff protection. So you had this tension within the empire where there were free traders and imperial preference advocates who said, well, it may be free trade in the empire, but let's have protection and high tariffs against those outside the empire. Whereas most businessmen in Britain wanted free trade with the whole world. So the trade with Canada was important to Britain, but trade with the United States was as important, if not more important. And Britain also had extensive trade with South America. Argentina, Chile played an important part in British economic thinking, and they were never part of the empire. So Britain did not see that protectionism was ever an important part of the empire. And this conflict within the empire was always there from the beginning. And an example of how this continued into the 20th century was when John Diefenbaker became Prime Minister in 1957, and then he got his majority in 58. And Diefenbaker campaigned on turning, I think it was 10% of our trade with the United States, he was going to redirect it, he said, to the United Kingdom. Well, when he tried to implement that and he went to the United Kingdom and talked to British officials, their response was, well, one way we can do it is let's have a free trade agreement between Canada and the UK. Well, when Diefenbaker brought that idea back home to Canada, his supporters, who were very pro-British on emotional levels and historical and political, well, wait a minute, free trade, that'll wipe out our agriculture, we don't want British foodstuffs coming in and competing with our foodstuffs. So when you actually brought the punch, can we have free, in those days, at that time, Canadians were not prepared to actually act on free trade with the United Kingdom. So not as a result, because they were working this way anyway, but when Canada decided not to go with free trade, the UK then said, fine, we're going into the European Union, the European Economic Community as it was at that time. Now this didn't hurt Canada, because what Diefenbaker was talking about was transferring our trade that was already flourishing with the United States to the UK. So it meant that we didn't make that transition, but we still had the flourishing trade with the US. So it did not seriously hurt Canada economically. It may have hurt our sense of independence, that we became more dominated by the Americans, but for economic cases it didn't. Australia and New Zealand were hurt more because they had closer trade with the UK and they didn't have the United States next to them as an alternative. So when the UK went into the European Economic Community and were forced then to discriminate against Australian and New Zealand products, as well as Canadian of course, but the reaction in Australia was stronger. In Canada, republicanism has always maintained a sort of constant level. It goes up and down, but there's always been a Republican movement in Canada, but it's never been dominant. And that's the case today. In Australia, however, prior to the 1960s, republicanism was really low by comparison with Canada. Australia was much more imperial-minded, much more pro-British, much more perhaps even pro-monarchical than Canada was. However, after UK went into Europe, the reaction in Australia was much stronger against, because they felt betrayed by the UK. So the economic policies had more of a political impact, I think, in Australia in particular than it ever did in Canada, with the result that republicanism, which for generations had been lower in Australia than Canada, has ever since been higher in Australia than it is in Canada. So economics did not become the basis for Commonwealth going forward. The third area is constitutional. Here we saw, from the days of empire to today, the transition of the crown from an imperial crown to national crown in each of the country. What that meant was that we moved also politically, constitutionally, from a subordinate station for each of the dominions to, as I mentioned, equality in 1931. Now, the original idea in everyone's mind, and if you look at the documents, they talk about a single crown. So in 1867, the empire had only one crown, and that was a transcendent crown for the whole empire. As we got into the 1920s and 30s, as the dominions became more self-governing and finally fully independent in 1931, the terminology still used was of one crown. If you look at the Statute of Westminster, it doesn't talk about crowns. It talks about a crown, the crown, loyalty to the crown, allegiance to the crown. So the belief was you could have a sovereign crown with separate parliaments without a common parliament. That, I think, did not work, because the British constitutional principles require a council to advise the crown and a parliament for the crown to operate within. So if you were going to have an imperial crown or a common crown, you needed a common parliament, which was the argument of the imperial federationists. Well, when that was rejected, what we tried from 1920s into the 1940s was, well, we could still have a common crown without a common parliament with national parliaments. Well, that fell apart as early as the abdication of Edward VIII, George VI's succession, when all the countries acted as if we had separate crowns, even though that had not officially been recognized, and eventually it then became recognized, so that the one crown multiplied itself into currently 16 crowns, sovereign crowns, because that is the only system that is compatible with the notion of parliamentary constitutional monarchy. If we were some sort of authoritarian monarchy with a crown, the monarch was not responsible to Parliament or did not act through Parliament, you could perhaps have had one crown, but because of our parliamentary practice in the Commonwealth, you could not have one crown without a parliament to go with it. And that's why the one crown multiplied itself through the Statute of Westminster and subsequently into multiple crowns. And as a result, there is no longer a Commonwealth sovereign crown. The crown exercises no sovereignty in the Commonwealth outside of the sovereignty it exercises within each individual country. And that's why in 1949 the title of head of the Commonwealth carried with it, and carries with it today, no connotation of sovereignty. Now, with republics being admitted, we took it another step. So first the idea of the Commonwealth was going to be, all right, a common allegiance to the same crown. Well, that proved not to work. So then it became, well, it's not a common crown, but it's a common monarch. So at least we have the same monarch. We're all loyal to George VI. Well, once India was allowed to stay in the Commonwealth as a republic, there's no longer even a common loyalty to the same sovereign. So it is just the head of the Commonwealth in some symbolic but non-authoritative role, and that, well, we'll make that work. Now, one possibility after that, George VI's view, and he stated, was he hoped India would be an exception. In fact, India became the norm, so the majority of the Commonwealth today are republics, not monarchies. Now, it could have evolved of a Commonwealth crown for the 16, I'm using the current numbers, but it wasn't always 16, so that they had some sort of special status within the Commonwealth, but that was rejected because the idea was that all the countries within the Commonwealth had to be equal and the same, so therefore you couldn't have a sovereign crown even for the 16, and that's why that has not developed. But at least we had the head of the Commonwealth. So there were the three things: that the crown was some way the central thing. The other was having belonged to the empire, but that's gone out the window now because Rwanda and Mozambique have been admitted, despite Walker's view that they shouldn't have been.